Welcome to the stage, CEO of the Geopolitical Institute, Pippa Malmgren.
Hey guys. Do I have to speak softly for all of you this morning? Right? Big night last night. We're going to get into some very big ideas today. I'm going to talk to you about what is happening in geopolitics in space and how that is profoundly influencing the geopolitics on Earth. I'm going to talk about the space economy that is rapidly unfolding and how it will dramatically transform the Earth economy. And tied into this is this very interesting question that I know this audience is especially interested in, which is the quest for what is now being called ultraterrestrial life. And you will see the reasons why as I progress. So let me begin with, we are currently not where you think we are. We are in a hot war in cold places. We are in a position where we have conflict between the superpowers in space. We have it in the high north, particularly the Arctic, and in the high seas. And we see signs of this all the time, but unfortunately people are so influenced by the way the press presents this, that where we're at war is in Ukraine, now in the Middle East. And this is partly because these other locations quite literally have no journalists. There are no journalists in space. There are no journalists on the open ocean. And the Arctic is a really hard place to hang out. So not many journalists there either. Also, there are no photo ops. It's very difficult to take photo ops of the events that are occurring in these somewhat invisible places. So I want to take you out of the mentality that the only place we're in conflict is in Ukraine and now in the Middle East. And I want to begin with an event that happened about 50 days before the Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, which was in the high north, in the Arctic, inside the Arctic Circle, on a tiny little island that belongs to Norway, although it has a very unusual history dating from the Versailles Treaty that more than 40 nations are entitled to be in this location. And on that tiny little island, someone tried to cut what is the fastest internet connection on Earth. Now, what is the fastest internet connection on Earth, being in a place where there are very few people and, frankly, a bunch of polar bears? The answer is that virtually every significant satellite, every high-altitude satellite, connects to Earth at Svalbard. So when someone cut that cable in two locations and basically took away about 6 kilometers of it, in theory, that could have easily meant the end of sat-nav, the end of GPS, the end of missile guidance. I know that may not mean anything to you. How about no more food delivery, right? No more Uber Eats. That was the purpose of that event, was to signal to the West, everything can be cut off. Now that we are in a world where everything depends on satellites. And it depends on the connection between satellites and earthbound infrastructure, particularly subsea cables. And you may or may not have noticed that we've had lots and lots of news stories about subsea cable warfare in the last, well, since the events in Ukraine began. Some of it's China, some of it's Russia, some of it is presumed to be the United States as well. So against that backdrop, let's now step back and understand where we are in history. Fundamentally, we're at a once-in-a-species moment because we are going back to the moon not to step on it, but to stay and to build launch pads that will go further because, of course, the moon has no gravity. So it's much easier to go further into space from there than it is from here. And this is one reason we see all the superpowers and some of the sub-superpowers all competing to get there first. Now, is this just ego? Is this also just billionaires who are joyriding with their gazillions of dollars? No. We're all on a quest for something that is truly, truly invaluable to humanity, which is abundance. Now, what are the sources of abundance? What is this new space race about? It is about the hunt for unlimited energy, unlimited resources, unlimited internet connectivity, unlimited computational capacity, and new physics. These are all, by themselves, invaluable prizes, but together, this is a new chapter in human history. So let me very quickly explain what I mean. Number one, both Caltech and Airbus have now proven that they can put mirrors on satellites, catch the sun's rays, convert them into radio waves, beam them to Earth safely, and ultimately have an unlimited supply of power in any electricity grid anywhere in the world at any time. Now, I know the entrepreneurs in the audience are asking, wait, when, right? It's one thing to prove it scientifically, it's another thing to scale it, to create the prototypes. All I can say is the prototypes are underway. And the entrepreneurs that I know in that space are like, we're 3 years away from seeing this live. So this is not a 25-year story. That's number one. Number two, we are literally in the process of building stars on Earth. Again, you may have seen the news stories about nuclear fusion. We're also restarting the nuclear fission story. Well, one of the things that you need for nuclear fusion is helium-3, and where do we find that? On the moon, it turns out, particularly at the South Pole. So these two things alone, we're starting to talk about the possibility of unlimited energy and displacing the current carbon-based energy systems. We are also talking about putting nuclear capability, nuclear power on the lunar surface. There's lots of discussion about the Rolls-Royce small nuclear reactors now being placed on the lunar surface to create effectively a star on the moon. That's energy. Now let's talk resources. We have now discovered we have the capacity to reach out into the galaxy and harvest resources from asteroids. I know that sounds so science fiction, it sounds so far away, but it's already begun. There are 2 asteroids you should be aware of. One is called Bennu, and the other is called Psyche. Well, Bennu, NASA has already brought back the samples from Bennu. There's a canister, I think it's something like 125 million miles away. They've brought it back, and they're currently dissecting it to understand what they have. But what they know they have is a wonderful quality of a sample. So this idea that we can't do it isn't true anymore. And that is why NASA and the Jet Propulsion Lab have launched the Psyche mission. Psyche is this one. And Psyche is said to be so laden with gold, iron ore, lithium, cobalt, pretty much everything that we need to make high tech is there. And that the value of it is literally $10 quintillion, which as an economist, I can tell you, no one knows what that means. No one. So let me put it a different way. If you were to distribute the value of Psyche to every single human on Earth, every one of us would be a billionaire. Maybe that hits home a little more easily. So bottom line, now we're going to be able to make iPhones and MRI scanners and fighter jets without needing to rip up Earth anymore. Pretty good, huh? Worth going for, right? And there's a reason the Saudis have invested in the space-based solar power, and they're very actively looking at nuclear fusion because they realize oil and gas is not going to be as needed or as valuable in future as all this comes online. Now, there's something else coming, which is interplanetary internet. Now, this is very interesting because when I say to people, the phone in your pocket is already capable of sending a text message to somebody on the moon. And they go, but I don't know anybody on the moon, and there's nobody there yet. That is true. But what we're about to come into is space-based manufacturing. And I mean both in orbit and on the lunar surface. On the lunar surface, the plans are already crystal clear. What will happen is the delivery of self-assembling, self-replicating 3D printers, which already are capable of taking lunar moon dust, which they call regolith, and turning it into bricks and being able to create buildings out of it. Already we have commissioned the first human habitat on the moon, which will also be capable of growing food, which has been in the news in the last couple of weeks. We've already seen the first space factory go up from a company called Varda in California. And what was Varda making in orbit? Very interesting entry into what is the future of manufacturing. Well, they were making drugs. And you say, what the heck? Why are they making drugs in space? And that certainly sounds like a science fiction novel. Well, the answer is lots of things happen in zero gravity that cannot happen in gravity. One of them is virtually every pharma company has a project on the International Space Station because there are certain ingredients that will bind in zero gravity, but they will not bind in gravity. Also, things like fiber optic cables. If you make them in gravity, they get little bubbles, and that slows down the speed of the transmission rate of the data. If you make them in zero gravity, no bubbles, much faster transmission rate. Already on the International Space Station, they are building human organs in a zero gravity environment because you don't need a human skeleton to support it in zero gravity. Also, they're building tissue. You probably have been following the whole, plant-based meat story. Well, now we have it in a space environment. Tissue construction in space. So these are some of the new fields that are coming online that will be manufacturing off of the Earth's surface. But there are others, and one of them is semiconductor production. We've already seen on Earth semiconductors have been moved from Taiwan to now Texas and Arizona. Well, the next place is up. And it turns out that you can make semiconductors much more efficiently with much higher capability if it's in zero gravity. Natural clean room, it's cold, it has all the features that you need. Data centers as well, and I put this headline from Axiom Space from just a few days ago of the huge push to put data centers into orbit and onto the moon. So, we're in a world where what used to be considered way far in the future is happening now. It kind of reminds me of that William Gibson line, that wonderful line where he says, the future has arrived, but it's unevenly distributed. So the people who are working at the cutting edge of this field are very aware how close we are to these things. And everybody else is like, 25, 30, 40, 50 years. Not so much. So everybody's watching the SpaceX project called the Starship. And the Starship is this tallest rocket right here. And the reason is because it's effectively a space truck, or call it a space taxi. The whole point is to be able to take things up and bring them back. The moment we have that capacity in a reliable commercial way, we're going to see an explosion of the space-bound economy. Also, we're reversing the focus in the space industry. Until now, the focus has been on how do you get stuff off of the Earth's surface and into space. Well, now we're talking about how do we build things in space. So, for example, the next James Webb telescope is highly unlikely to be built on Earth. It's very likely to be constructed either in a space-based factory or a lunar surface factory. So if we take all this together, what I am talking about is huge amount of space-based solutions to traditional Earth-bound problems. And the possibility that we start to get genuine abundance and we're genuinely able to solve so many of the issues that I know you in this audience are concerned with and preoccupied by. By the way, let me also say I know that immediately the first assumption is, okay, well then there are going to be no jobs for anybody on Earth. I would say quite the opposite. And I'm already seeing so many people come into the space economy almost literally on a laptop. It's an ideal situation for the nomadic, digital entrepreneurs to be able to operate in these remote locations without having to be in traditional companies. It's a whole new development of jobs, in my opinion, but we can have a discussion about that. What is clear is governments are investing massively in another thing you need to make this all happen, which is extraordinary computational capability. Exascale computers, quantum computing. Now there's a race just in that realm in order to reach the abundance that I'm speaking about. Why? Because fundamentally, that computational capability is all about being able to solve problems. Now, I know a lot of you here are very familiar with what is happening in that computation race, and you know about the speed at which we're able to solve problems. But for those who don't, we've gone from being able to solve a problem in 10,000 years back in maybe 2017 to 2019, which was considered a miracle at the time because humanity would never be able to solve that problem just using our own brains. That same problem today has been solved by Google with its new Sycamore computer in 200 seconds. So we go from 10,000 years to solve a problem to 200 seconds to solve a problem. Well, this is the beginning of how space is starting to influence the discovery of new materials. So already we are now able to reverse a situation humanity has faced, which is normally we start with a material and we shape it to a need, right? You start with a log and you turn it into a ship. Now we can start with a need and we can build that material atom by atom by atom. And we're doing the same thing with life itself. And we're doing these things not only on Earth, but we're doing them in space, where we are discovering all kinds of new materials that we have never imagined before. And we haven't begun to think about what are we going to shape them into or how are we going to construct them. Google has already announced, for example, that this supercomputing capability has allowed the discovery of over 380,000 new materials that we have never seen before. Now let's add to this the explosion of activity in artificial intelligence. Because again, space is so huge that you need just targeting where you want to be is very difficult. So the combination of supercomputing and AI are at the fore of the development of this new space. Now, as we go into space, we're also discovering new physics. After all, if you can make things in new ways there because zero gravity provides such a different environment, surprise, surprise, it's basically the best, most exciting, most extraordinary physics lab that humanity has ever been inside of. And every single day, we're kind of punching holes in the traditional understanding of physics. And every time we punch a hole in it, what's on the other side that gets illuminated? More and more, it's the realm of quantum physics. And of course, the Nobel Prize was awarded to quantum physics 2 years ago. Now it's a legitimate subject. Now money is going into it, and it's coalescing with all these other things that I am describing. So with that, now we're going to come into probably the part you came for, which is what is happening with this question about life beyond us. So let's go back to this notion of what is the war we think we're in versus what is the actual conflict that we're in. It is very much to do with space and the creation of satellites that are literally the size of a shoebox. So for example, Elon Musk's support of Ukraine through the Starlink satellite network has been invaluable to Ukraine. It is pretty much the reason why they have been able to manage facing off against a much larger, much better equipped superpower. I mean, fundamentally, Ukraine is pretty outgunned and outnumbered. So having access to that mega constellation of satellites has been crucial. And already, both the Chinese and the Russians, but particularly the Chinese, have accused Starlink of being a military entity. And Elon said, no, we're not. And they said, but yes, you are, because Ukraine can only do offensive operations thanks to this internet capability that you provided that's space-based, which is one reason you saw the announcement that Starlink turned down the bandwidth a bit on Ukraine. It was to avoid being designated as a military opponent in the current conflict that we're in. So space has now become a contested location because it's affecting the balance of power on Earth. Recently, we've seen Russia, for example, announce that they want to move nuclear weapons into space, which created a big kerfuffle both in Congress and with the US defense establishment. Frankly, we are at a moment in history where nuclear weapons are primed, and we do have superpowers threatening each other to use them. Now, I know this is heavy for a Saturday morning, and my question to you is, would you rather know or would you rather not know? There are lots of people who would rather not know, but where we are is very, very similar to where we were in 1962 when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. My father was actually an advisor to Kennedy on the missile trajectories during that event, so I've had the opportunity to understand what happens when you really get down to 4 hours before a potential nuclear exchange and how humans react to that moment. Here's the good news. He said what he learned from that experience is it always ends the same way. It literally ends in a hug. And it sounds so crazy. What do you mean it ends in a hug? Well, once you realize the only option is to fire or to come to resolution. And again, I worked for Ronald Reagan, and no one could imagine Reagan and Gorbachev even meeting, let alone shaking hands, embracing, practically kissing. My dad worked for Nixon. No one could imagine Nixon and Brezhnev meeting at a time when we were on the brink of nuclear annihilation. So, given that we're at this point, it's very interesting to see that within the scientific and military establishments, we're beginning to get the stories that whenever we go to this point in history, strange things start happening around our nuclear weapons systems. When we turn radiation on, things start happening. So one of them, as an example, was in 1967, and it's an example of why the whole subject of is there anything else but us became so secret, and the penalty for speaking about it was so severe. And just to give you an idea, basically everybody in the military who was at the front line of nuclear capability signing non-disclosure agreements that if you break, you go straight into a military tribunal, your name will never be heard by the public, and the penalty might be something like 10 to 30 years at Leavenworth. That would be enough to silence most people. So what happened was, in Montana, at this ICBM location, there were 3 separate ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile systems. They all went off at the same time. Statistically, this is impossible. They're all on totally separate circuits, totally separate command structures. They all go off, and everybody there sees all kinds of things flying around in the sky. Now, they're all told to shut up because we don't want the Russians to know, or the Soviets at that time, to know that there are circumstances under which our nuclear weapons arsenal doesn't work. 3 of the most senior officers said, forget it, I have to report this. This is insane. We have to explore what the heck is this. Those 3 people were sent to Harvard University for medical checks. And they were sent to see a guy called John Mack, who was there and ended up heading that department of psychiatry at Harvard in later years. John Mack met with these 3 very senior officers, and he concluded they're not lying. They definitely saw something. There definitely was an event at this location. Fast forward to 2021. We have actually had press conferences from all kinds of scientists and senior military officials talking about how some phenomena shows up whenever we go live with nuclear weapons. By the way, it's very interesting that Wernher von Braun, in his personal diaries, at the Trinity event, which was the first nuclear explosion in human history, describes a whole bunch of orbs showed up in the sky. Weird. Question is, why don't we ask questions? Where is our curiosity? Answer, because this has all been heavily suppressed because of the geopolitical implications of acknowledging that it was true. So let's fast forward to where we are now. So we had some Navy pilots, and they have now testified to Congress. One of them is Ryan Graves. Ryan, who I've met, and who is one of our most senior people in the military establishment. He's not just a fighter jet pilot, he's a commander of a squadron, he's a Top Gun instructor. So he and his crew were seeing these strange orbs with black spheres inside them every single time they were going up in the air. And when they got near them, and they're traveling at speeds that are incomprehensible to us, that don't fit any of our physics, they started to affect the instrumentation on our fighter jets. And so happily, these guys are very good at catching a plane that falls out of the sky. But nonetheless, this is a problem. And he realized if we go to the Pentagon and we say, we got the situation, they're going to pull my license and I will be thrown out of the Navy. That is exactly right. So he cleverly came up with this idea, okay, let's go and say, look, we have triangulated on this thing using multiple sets of instruments, particularly FLIR cameras, which are the most sophisticated cameras we have, infrared, radar, and multiple sets of senior pilot eyes. Well, the instrumentation came back, they're all seeing the same thing. So for the first time, it's not your imagination. We have actual data points that say something is there, it's moving at crazy speeds in crazy ways that we cannot explain. Even still, if I take this to the Pentagon, they're going to pull my license, they're going to throw me out. So he says, wait a minute, what if we present this as a health and safety issue? What if we say we have trillions of dollars of equipment at risk and at least billions of dollars of pilots at risk? Then you can't really ignore it. Well, that was the beginning of what has turned into 5 years of private hearings in Congress with over 40 witnesses from similar roles coming forward talking about what are we experiencing that we're not allowed to talk about because of our non-disclosure agreements. Now that led to Congress saying, okay, we got to come up with whistleblower legislation to allow these people to come forward. The first of this group you will all have heard about, David Grush, former Geospatial Intelligence Agency, National Reconnaissance Office. You literally cannot get any more senior in the intelligence community than he was. He was actually assigned to work on this issue, and like me, I mean, if you told me 5 years ago I'd be talking about this, I would have burst out laughing. And he would have too. But he started to do the work because he was assigned to it and started to discover something is happening here that doesn't make sense. So now we go to the incident where China had a balloon over the United States. Long story, I won't go into the details because we're limited on time, but fundamentally, where does that balloon end up? It ends up over Wyoming and Montana. And everybody goes, but it's no big deal because it didn't have any weapon systems on it. But what's in Wyoming and Montana? Intercontinental ballistic missile launch sites at a time when superpowers are threatening each other. If you wanted to know how are the Americans preparing or not, are they worried, are they nervous? So simple, one little camera with facial recognition capability. And then I can identify, are you worried? Are you calm? Are you in a hurry? Is everything fine? What's interesting is we shot down that balloon, and the US Navy was sent to go pick it up. All sorts of photographs. I don't know why they're coming out all pixelated, but some photographs of the US Navy SEALs picking up the wreckage. Well, that week we had 3 further objects that the United States shot down. One over, I think it was Alaska, one was the Great Lakes, and can't remember the third one. These were not traditional aircraft. They had no visible means of propulsion. They were strange shapes like the sphere. So bottom line, if we are dealing with something that has now been identified by sensors and has data points, is the right reaction to shoot at it? Interesting question for humanity. If we come into contact with potentially a higher intelligence, should we be shooting at it? Well, this is now an open question in the strategic security community. And that's important, that it's even allowed to be a question. So let's take a moment, and now we're going to begin to shift a little faster into where we are. So people say, well, why don't they tell us? Well, the answer is we've already had quite a few press conferences from all these organizations, 2 from the White House, the Department of Defense, the Air Force. They have already said unidentified anomalous phenomena, which is the new name for this thing, are real. They've said. So nobody can say they didn't say it. They've said it repeatedly. What it is, nobody knows. But I think Senator Gillibrand put it really well. She said, given this environment, saying we don't know whether they're Russian or Chinese or something else is no longer an acceptable answer. And that is why now a lot of resources are going into what is it? Senator Rubio put it a different way, and I would point out this is a remarkable subject in that it's pretty much the only thing we see a full-hearted bipartisan support for. How interesting. So Senator Rubio put it really simply. He's like, either our most important people in the intelligence community are all simultaneously losing their minds with the same hallucination, not good, or something historic is happening. And you have to ask yourself, why would so many people with so much to lose be coming forward so forcefully at this time? Now, there are really a load of people who say, it's all a conspiracy, it's government. Okay, that's one way to look at it. Others look at it differently. This is an open subject. There are no big conclusions yet. What I will say is that fundamentally, we are discovering new things that change our understanding of the possibility of life beyond ourselves. When I was a kid, the idea that there was water on the moon was literally insane. Okay, now we've discovered it's there. The idea that the blueprints for DNA, the component parts for DNA, have already been discovered on asteroids, therefore the possibility of life, that also would have been considered insane when I was growing up. But NASA has already told us they have found the component parts of DNA on meteors. We have also already seen the announcement about exoplanets. I actually took the time to go meet Didier Queloz, who got the Nobel Prize in, I think it was 2019, for the discovery of exoplanets. Again, 30 years ago when he suggested maybe there are other planets that are similar to Earth. Not identical, but within a range. Completely nuts. Well, the James Webb Telescope went up. And how many exoplanets have we now identified? And it's just started the count. I checked last week, 5,000, I think it was 640. So this idea that there are no conditions like Earth doesn't also work anymore. So let's come back to this idea of punching holes in our traditional understanding of what is possible. Maybe what we're talking about, and I'm just now relating what I'm hearing from the people involved in this research and this conversation, maybe we're talking about interdimensionality. This is one reason you hear some of these people testifying to Congress about maybe it's co-located with us. It's not coming from space, it's an interdimensional phenomena. Well, we can mathematically prove, I think it's 19 different dimensions now. I've given you an image of a tesseract. You may remember Carl Sagan talking about, we're 3D people. It's very hard for us to imagine a fourth dimension. The only way to see it is to create a 3D object and then have a shadow go through it, a tesseract. Then you can begin to see what a fourth dimension might look like. Well, now, if you want to go to further dimensions, there's a new idea of a Calabi-Yau, which is very interesting to Google if you get a chance. So this idea of maybe we're dealing with interdimensionality. Some take the view maybe we're building AI and the AI is already speaking to us. It's ours in that sense. Maybe. Maybe it's to do with our understanding of religion. I think it's super interesting that just before lockdown, the Vatican held an event at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And the subject was our future in space. But they invited Avril Haines, the head of the Office of National Intelligence, to discuss the possibility that we might find life beyond ourselves. What was fascinating was the effective conclusion of that conference from the Catholic Church point of view was, it's okay, because they're God's children too. Nice, square the circle, excellent. So don't worry, right? If we find stuff, we're cool with that. Very interesting the way there's this sort of forward-looking approach amongst many different kinds of institutions, from the religious world to the military world. So why don't they just disclose whatever is known? I think, having really looked at this now, part of it is there are massive legal liability issues here. How do you tell Congress that you've been taking funds and using them in programs related to the subject, but not telling them about it? There's no legal protection for that. If it turns out that there's any truth to the idea that there's been materials that have been retrieved and given to private defense companies, and they have been working on them and have been creating something new with them, and I'm not saying they have, but if this is a possibility, they're going to face unbelievable legal liability because all their competitors are going to say, you had an unfair advantage. You were given something by government that we didn't get. So I think they're all totally preoccupied with legal liability, and I'm like, excuse me, guys, but isn't there a larger question here of what the heck is going on? And they're like, yeah, we'll get to that. Why will they get to that? Well, if I'm right about what I've described in Geopolitics, we're in the middle of a much bigger conflict than the one that we see on the ground in Ukraine and the Middle East. Is now the time to ask the Department of Defense to show us what you have? Maybe this is not the ideal moment. And by the way, let's not forget, the Pentagon is under a legal obligation to submit to a full audit every year for the last 6 years. And for those 6 years, they have not been able to comply, not once. Nobody knows where all this money is going. Now, I'm not saying it's all going on this. I am saying that this issue of can you account for what you've been doing, nobody wants to answer the question. And this is partly why. The other big issue is also, what if our top scientists have been working on all this? And like Oppenheimer, this is the most super secret stuff. Again, how much of that is in the national interest to reveal, how much is not? These are fundamental questions. Now, I think it's super interesting that we are now being made aware that government in the United States has been devoting resources to the study of strange, interesting places. Maybe some of you have been to the pyramids and inside the King's Chamber. They're devoting time and attention to the study of altered states of consciousness in this context. Why? Because one line of thinking is maybe this has to do with consciousness. Now, what's the one subject we know almost nothing about? Consciousness. In fact, even to say you were a scientist studying consciousness a few years ago was to remove all your possibility of raising any funds. So these things seem to be coalescing. Now, why are they coalescing so fast and right now? I think it's a number of things. One is militaries have lost their monopoly on the positioning of cameras and sensors, not only in space, but in other locations. So they no longer control all the data. Private institutions are now accessing these sensors and these data flows. So if there is something, it's not very easy to hide it any longer. And you can't threaten the private sector the way you can threaten a military official with Leavenworth. So suddenly this is all becoming more visible in the public domain, and I think that's a major contributing reason why. In addition to that, there is a possibility of what is being described as catastrophic disclosure. Catastrophic disclosure is the possibility that somebody else announces it first. So as one scenario, what if China gets to the lunar surface first, which right now is looking like a real probability? What if they say we have exascale computers that are on a scale that the West can't even imagine? What if they say we're on the moon, we have the best AI, we have the best exascale computers, and we have contact? Now, does it have to be true? Maybe not. In the West, the reaction I get to that is, well, prove it. But you have to remember, we in the West, we had a revolution because of Descartes. Arthur Koestler, the philosopher, called it the Cartesian catastrophe, where we split the mind from the body, we split reality and provable things from mystical things. And we said only reality is worthy of our time. And anything that's mystical or strange or liminal or numinous or doesn't fit testability, yeah, all that is the you're nuts category or your religious category. But the rest of the world didn't have a Cartesian revolution. They have always seen it holistically. There's no conflict between the things you can prove and the things that you know, that you experience. So if a nation like China says, we're there, most of the world is going to believe that. And that will be a Sputnik moment, where all of the devotion that has gone to NASA and Los Alamos and our incredible scientific capability in the West has the risk of shifting to Beijing. Now, that is a compelling story that is currently preoccupying all of those people who are working on this. The message that I have to all these folks who are involved in this subject is, if we are talking about true abundance and the possibility that there is life or physics beyond what we have understood, then what are we going to do with all that abundance? One choice is you take what I call the Gollum approach, which is it's mine, all mine, nobody else's. Or we can do what George C. Marshall did at the end of World War II, which is to say the way you end geopolitical conflict is to share. You build a Marshall Plan. You rebuild Europe. And right now we're on the brink of having to potentially rebuild not just Ukraine, but frankly, we're going to have to bring Russia back into the world economy somehow or another, or we'll continue to have a problem. So the question is, not only how do you recognize that we have this possibility, but what are we going to do with it? And is there a way to share the abundance with all of humanity, share the new discoveries in physics, share the recognition, if there is one to be had, about what is life beyond us? And that is the point I'd like to leave all of you on. We've spent our entire lives being driven by scarcity. It's a way of thinking. It's an assumption set. Everything I've described tells us there is a possibility of abundance. That will require a whole new way of thinking. And so that's why I wanted to do a talk for you on the space race and the quest for ultra-terrestrial life, because we're not talking necessarily about life like us that just isn't on this planet. We're talking about a whole spectrum of scientific possibility. And that is what we have to open our minds up to. And so I leave you, just finish by saying, all of this is an incredible invitation to our curiosity. Thank you very much.